Hey, hello, and welcome to another edition of the Watch Club. My name is James Sullivan. I am the program director of the Newburyport Documentary Film Festival. And for the last quite a bit of time now, actually, we've been doing monthly interviews with filmmakers whose films are now new to streaming, in addition to our typical in-person programming here in Newburyport. We have a great one today. We have the filmmakers behind Dear Mr. Brody, which is now streaming on Discovery Plus. It's a nutty story, which I will not try to explain. I'm just going to let the trailer do the talking for us. Keith Maitland and Sarah Wilson are the filmmaking team behind the film. They're going to be with us in a minute, but first, let's just take a look at the trailer for those of you who haven't had a chance to take a look at the film yet.
Dear Sir, I know the possibilities you ever receiving this letter about 1 in a million, but I'm so desperate at this stage for help that I just gotta try for the sake of my family.
So a few years ago, I was working for a film producer and I'd gone to LA to visit his storage unit. While I was there, I noticed about 12 boxes filled with letters. There were so many letters. They were all postmarked January 1970, all addressed to Michael James Brody Jr. And I'm talking thousands and thousands and thousands of letters stacked in boxes. And they were all unopened.
I'm going to give away, I think, $50 million within the next year and set up a foundation and give money to the poor.
Dear Mr. Brody.
Dear Mike.
Dear Mr. Brody, I've read so much about you.
He makes a major announcement that if anybody needs money, here's your answer, Michael Brody. Bingo.
I want to try and cure the problems of the world.
He is so imbued by love that he is going to share his love with everybody by giving them money.
It was 8 6-foot bags stacked with mail from all over the world.
There were hundreds, thousands, I don't know how many people were in the street. He took a handful of 20s and threw it out the window just to watch the madness.
Dear Mr. Brody, are you happy?
He had a plan to end the war in Vietnam.
Do you know much about PCP?
We got on a helicopter and we go to the White House. And he tells him that we're here to see Nixon.
Dear Mr. Brody.
Dear Mr. Brody.
Dear Mr. Brody, the reason I'm writing is right now I have 6 children. We live in an old log house. If I could just receive some help.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Brody.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Brody.
Dear Mike.
Was he sincere? Was he a victim? Was he a victimizer?
I want to open up every single letter.
Keith Maitland and Sarah Wilson, welcome to the Watch Club.
Thanks,
Hi.
James. Be here.
Hey.
You're coming to us from your home in Austin, Texas, correct?
That's right.
And we should mention that although Sarah has kept her born name, right? You are a married couple.
We are.
Correct?
We're married.
Yes. Yes.
We're married and professional co-conspirators.
Yes.
Right. Exactly. So, Sarah, you were on this film. You were the producer, one of the producers, and a cinematographer, right?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And Sarah works also as a professional photographer beyond Keith's film work.
Yeah, I started with still photographs, portraiture, documentary work, and then we ended up working together right before Tower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sarah actually preceded me in documentary. The only reason I am a documentary filmmaker is because I was so inspired by Sarah's documentary photography. Mm-hmm. At the earliest stage of our relationship, we met in the summer of 2003, and she had an art show, a photo show in the fall of 2003 that changed my life and made me realize that I could be focusing on true stories and trying to connect with people the way she did.
And that was in New York City. You mentioned before we went on that's where you met, right? So that show was in New York City.
The show was in New York City, but it was about Jasper, Texas, where the hate crime occurred in 1998. I did long-term documentary project that was basically portraits of people in the town of Jasper in the aftermath of the fire. But it showed in New York.
Keith, you were in TV storytelling before entering the documentary world. Is that right?
Yeah, I started out wanting to be a writer-director, and I was really fortunate to get into working on other people's movies at a young age. Here in Texas, I did some work for Richard Linklater when I was undergrad in college. I worked for the Muppets up in New York. I worked for MTV briefly, and then after school, I started crewing on big-budget features and TV series in New York as an assistant director.
Mm-hmm. I happen to notice that you worked for some years on Law and Order. My late father-in-law would have loved to have been here to hear what you would have to say about that experience, but we're here to talk about documentaries. So let's talk about Dear Mr. Brody. Start with the basics if you can. I'm sure you've told this story a bunch, but if one of you can tell, or both of you can tell us the story about how you came across the story in the first place. It was the letters, right?
Yeah, well, Sarah actually heard about it before I did.
Yes, my roommate from NYU, I went to NYU for undergrad. My roommate actually asked me to meet her for coffee one day and said, I have something to show you. And she brought this stack of letters that she had discovered, and we started opening them, and that kind of drew us in. And there you go.
And then I got a little greedy. So her roommate was Melissa Robin Glassman, who you saw featured in the trailer there. Yeah. And Melissa had worked for years for legendary Hollywood producer Ed Pressman. And it was in Ed's storage unit that Melissa found these letters. And she asked Ed what the letters were. And Ed said, in the 70s, he had tried to make a movie about Michael Brody's story, and he had commissioned a screenwriter, and he made a rights deal with the family, and the letters came along with all that somehow. And anyway, long story short, the movie never got made, but Ed couldn't bear to let go of the letters. So when Melissa found him, her initial thought was, why don't we pick up where Ed left off in the 70s? Why don't we find a new screenwriter, write a new screenplay? And so she photographed the letters as a favor, just to have some photos of these beautiful documents to include in the pitch package while she was trying to develop the screenplay. And I don't know, something just like, I know it struck Sarah when she heard the story. It struck me when Sarah told me about it. And then when I talked to Melissa, and I felt very strongly, almost immediately, that there was an incredible documentary to be told focused on these letters. And so I asked Melissa what she thought, and here we are.
And so then I got thousands of letters.
Right. Was that, that first cup of coffee with Melissa, was that way back in college days for you? Or
that was 2015?
It was like 2015 or so.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not like you've been sitting on this story for 20 years or anything.
No.
Right. Okay.
It's been that long since I graduated from college. What are you saying?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry. Did I say 20? I meant 8.
I don't know what you said.
Tell me a little bit about what you found out in obviously uncovering this story. It seems to me that people of a certain age who were, adultish in 1970 when this actually happened, and people who were around New York at that age definitely would remember this story.
You would think so, James.
Well, other than that, what I was going to follow up on, other than that, I would think that nobody knows this story. Nobody knew this story until you started to tell it, right? Nobody remembered it.
It doesn't seem like very many people remember the story, even the people that we reached out to. My mom is the exact same age as Michael Brody. She was 21 when this all went down.
She worked in Midtown.
She worked in Midtown Manhattan. She lived in Brooklyn. She has no memory of this.
No idea, right.
Melissa's mom's right around the same age. Her parents, like Michael and Renee, got married that year, went on their honeymoon to Jamaica, just like Michael and Renee. They didn't remember this. And then eventually, as we started getting into the story and tracking down letter writers, we would reach out to people and say, hey, we found this letter that you wrote to Michael Brody. Do you remember this hippie millionaire who offered to give away his money? And the people who wrote letters didn't seem to remember. So it's truly a story that had been lost to history for many, many people. That said, we have certainly also encountered folks now that the movie's coming out, people are reaching out and saying, not only do I remember that, I remember writing a letter. Did you find my letter? And some of Michael's old friends, who we would have loved to have talked to, 2-3 years ago when we were making this, have started to pop up and said, why didn't you call me? We have stories to tell. So
where were you?
Yeah, I don't know.
Right. So the story, it's about Brody and his stunt, but it ends up being pretty much more about the letter writers and the people who, and the people's hopes and dreams and what they were hoping to accomplish if he chose them out of these, gigantic mounds of letters that were sent to him. Right. Can you talk a little bit about the visual sense of the film, because it's beautiful? It's so much fun. I mean, there's stuff, you can see it in the trailer. There's some stuff that's just some of the graphic design stuff and the collage work that you guys did and all of that really sort of revives the hippie vibe of the era, obviously, for because that's the setting. But just it's so much fun visually, and you've obviously become known for that. We'll get to Tower in a minute, your previous film, but can you talk a little bit about how you developed the ideas for some of that sort of collage work and animated design stuff that's in the film?
Yeah, I think we knew from the get-go that we wanted to really play with the aesthetics of January 1970. We're right on the heels of the 60s. This is just 4 months after Woodstock, 2 months after Altamont. It's a time period that I kind of grew up being enamored of. I was born in 1975, so I missed all that. But I've always related to the culture and arts of that time, and so it's a rich terrain to draw from. But even richer than that is all the imagery within the letters. I think that's one of the most important elements of the story, is that the letters that spoke to us, the letters that grabbed us, the ones you gravitated towards and going through the pile, as you can see there, are the more colorful letters. They're letters that had photographs inside, or they had drawings on the envelope.
Or they had stationery that was like from the time period. So much of what we used for those, the collages, were just cutouts of, stationery. And we didn't actually cut with actual scissors, but yeah, digital cutouts of this stationery that was kind of lovely to use.
Yeah. So as we were kind of developing the look of the film, we knew that we were going to use as much archival footage as we could, and that archival footage would tell a textured and detailed story of those times. But archival footage is very broad, in the quality of what you get. And so we knew some of it would be rough, some of it would be really saturated and beautiful. So for our interviews, we chose to do a really simple kind of black box interview that was like a shadowy kind of dark scene that honored kind of like the fact that this story was lost a little bit to history, that had been kind of tucked away in a dark, storage locker for 50 years. So that was all kind of came into play. We also made the decision early on I've never done this before, but to shoot interviews in front of a table, so that we'd have a place to put the letters if people wanted to open letters and talk about stuff. And it worked out really well because it gave our subjects something to lean on, something kind of to emote against. And it also helped bring all those interviews into shape. I mean, what you're seeing here is a picture of what we called a letter reading party. And that's actually a local elementary school around the corner from us. It's a decommissioned elementary school library. The school was mostly empty. And
not very good air conditioning on a hot
No,
day.
it was a hot shoot in like an August,
Austin humidity, right? Sure.
Yeah. But, we chose it because it was a library, and it kind of, so much of what we do is about digging into the library, of history, like researching, finding obscure facts, finding old phone books, and reaching out to people. So every, aesthetic decision that we make, ties to the subject matter, ties to the time period, ties to like some kind of ethos or grammar. But you asked about the collages, and the funny thing to me about the collages is they were the last creative decision that we made really in the process. We were probably 3/4 of the way through the film. And we made a decision at the outset not to do any kind of like rotoscope animation like what we'd done with Tower. That felt so singular for that story. But as we kept getting further and further in, we knew that we wanted a volume of imagery that really like honored the volume of images in the letters. And we wanted something that played with the aesthetics of that time in a fresh way and in a fun way. And one day I was on Facebook, and a Facebook friend of mine who I had never met, he was actually a musician who had reached out to me while I was making Tower, and he had offered up some music for me to consider for Tower. That I didn't end up working with him on that because I already had a composer and all that stuff figured out. But I became Facebook friends with him because he made good art, and I liked what he had to say for himself musically. And one day he posted a music video that he had made himself. That was that collage technique.
Oh,
it wasn't exactly like the ones we made, but it was similar enough to that when I saw it and I saw the motion, the colors, the movement, I was immediately thrown back to Monty Python and the great collage interstitial thing.
For sure. Yeah.
You know, I thought about my time as a kid. My mom and my brother and I, we would make crafts, you know, on the weekends. We were a very crafty family. And, you know, imagine sitting on the floor, cutting out old magazines just to make new images. We do it with our son, Theo, now. And so it just kind of hit me. I brought it to the team, to Sarah and Melissa and Megan, our fourth producer, and kind of like the last of our, you know, our kind of four-way creative decision-making table, and said, what do you guys think about adding in one more visual layer? And I think we're a little skeptical. I'm just going to say, you know, one, we didn't have it budgeted.
Right.
And we were pretty deep into the project. And two, the project was already dense with imagery. But something in me felt sure that we needed to make sure that we were being playful and that we were, you know, having motion and energy and imparting, you know, messages, you know, subliminally and you know, lightning fast. And so anyway, they all joined on. The collages were made by a great artist. So I mentioned my Facebook friend, his name is John Mark Lapham, and he really helped elevate the whole project.
Yeah. So, I mean, that I'm glad I asked, because the, you know, sort of the onslaught of imagery, all of it, you know, kind of helps evoke the era when, you know, you've kind of got black and white footage in a lot of cases of the news guys following Brody around. But obviously the era was the Dayglow era, and it's a lot, you know, there's a lot, you know, in our collective memory, it's a lot more vivid than that. So that really helped a lot. I'm going to take a quick moment to just say that anyone who's watching, those of you who are watching live, if you care to ask a question of Keith and or Sarah, all you got to do is post a question in the YouTube comments section, and producer Steve will take care of it and feed it to me. And I'm also going to say that while you're on there on the YouTube page, please, if you haven't already done so, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Let's get those numbers up. So, okay, Keith and Sarah, I'm going to ask you one more thing, I think, about this film, about Brody, and then I'm going to ask you a couple questions about Tower, if that's okay. But so is there, having completed the project now, I mean, it's such a slice of the hippie era story, you know, 1970 in New York City. It's such a small slice, you know, but is there any kind of broader thoughts that you've been able to come up with about what Brody's story has to say about that era in American history? And, you know, it's a big, pretty vague question, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. I mean, you know, besides the fact that it's a very specific, you know, momentary news story, can you expand it in any way to, you know, or you know, maybe it has something to do with the letter writers themselves. Like they all collectively give us a time capsule of what it was like to be an average person who, you know, had hopes and dreams in 1970 that maybe they couldn't fulfill on their own, out of their own income, and sort of thought this, you know, weird hippie dude who's supposedly a millionaire, would help them out with. I mean, that's probably more to the point, right?
Well, I felt like over and over again, we would read the letters and people were pouring very personal details of their lives into these letters. And and maybe something they've never told anyone else. A lot of people weren't going to see a therapist at that time. Like they weren't sharing, a lot of people just weren't sharing those parts of their lives with people. And so these letters became so personal and kind of like a relief or a release valve for certain letter writers. And they would definitely thank him at the end of the letter saying, I'm so glad I got to write this down. I just needed someone to talk to. I needed someone to listen to me. And so I do think that has something to do with that time period, that people were willing to open themselves up in that way. And that it was so singularly important to them to be able to do that. Yeah. That's such a great point that therapy was not necessarily nearly as much of the picture of everyday life then, and you can hear it, that these people were dying to tell their story to someone, right? And strangely enough, turned out to be this guy who, Brody. Right. And then people weren't making their own podcasts, and they weren't, right, Instagramming about what's going on in their life. So yeah, I think that was definitely that time period.
Yeah, there's a sense of expression. I also think when it comes to Brody's story, and James, what you were talking about, like that kind of hippie culture, Brody's, he was born at the beginning of the baby boom. He's a boomer who, like many in his generation, was drastically different in his social approach, in his view of the world, than his own parents were. The generation gap that is front and center at that moment in time, really put the contrasts in society, front and center. Coming out of the 60s, you've got the civil rights movement, women's liberation, the anti-war movement, the incredible explosion in arts and culture happening for that generation. And there's this real sense that this generation is there to change the world. And as January 1970 dawns, a lot of that 60s energy is really getting doused. It's easy to kind of forget that Richard Nixon is the president at this time, and it's not the disgraced, quitter that we grew up knowing about. He's like got pretty high approval ratings and was elected, with a mandate to kind of take back the country from these radical hippies, right? And to bring us a sense of calm and Brody fights that. He gets out there and he says, stop fucking around with the war. Change the world, bring an end to poverty, give people who need what they need. And I really respect that. I always respond to that sort of message. It wasn't delivered, with a plan to back it up, unfortunately. So it does. But the intention that Brody has and the kind of spirit of that generation in that moment, I think is something that's exciting to consider and to play with. We were lucky to play with that stuff. Absolutely. Well, we're lucky to have had you do so. Let's just go ahead and take a look at the Tower trailer for anyone who hasn't seen it. Steve, hang on one second. I'm just going to say, if you haven't seen it, you should see it. It came out in 2016. You guys got a lot of acclaim for this film, Keith, right? And you'll see why in a minute if you haven't seen it. So let's take a look at the trailer real quick, and then I have a couple questions.
I was in Shakespeare class when it started, and we all ran to the windows of the English building.
Everybody was in a state of panic. It was just chaos.
It's like a battle scene.
There are two different kinds of shots.
Apparently, police are returning the fire now.
My mission was to get into the tower.
I can't make out what you're saying. You keep cutting out now.
There's a guy on top of the tower, and he's shooting at people.
We didn't know who was being killed. People were dying.
There's no report as to who this man may be, or what he's doing up there, or what prompted this apparent madness.
Then what happened?
Then everybody ran.
I just remember looking up at the sky. It was so blue. And just thinking, I guess this is it.
You're gonna be okay.
For those who aren't familiar, would you mind, Keith, describing, or either of you, if Sarah, if this is something you worked on, I'm not sure, the rotoscoping technique. Can you just explain what it is?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm the producer and director of Tower. Sarah's cinematographer and executive producer of the film. Rotoscoping is a process of taking live action film or video and then applying on top of it layers of, in our instance, hand-drawn art, and then removing the video underneath and letting the art kind of speak for itself. But it's a way to create animation that is, highly reflective of reality, in various instances. And for I think the primary excitement for us in using it is a way to allow actors who are performing the recreations that the film is almost entirely based on, for their performances to really come through in the animation, not just as a voiceover performance, but the details of their facial expression, the look in their eyes, the physicality of the performance really comes through.
So you mentioned, Keith, earlier that you did some work. We were still in college with Linklater, right? Richard Linklater. And
yeah.
What did you work on? Waking Life? Waking Life.
It's interesting. The movie that I worked on with him was called The Newton Boys, and it was the film he made before Waking Life. Undoubtedly, he was probably prepping Waking Life while I was working there, but I wasn't aware of that. I moved to New York, and it was about a year after I moved to New York that Waking Life premiered. And having worked, for Linklater just 2 years earlier, I was excited to go see his new film, and I was really blown away by it. I didn't have any relationship to rotoscoping or any, real appreciation of adult animation, at that age, and I think Waking Life really showed me a new way to kind of contextualize, kind of high-minded thought processes around film. Waking Life is all about an exploration of dreams. And, the film that I made before Tower, my first feature documentary, is called The Eyes of Me. And it's a film about a group of blind teenagers. And I made use of rotoscope animation in that film. Tower has about 40 minutes of animation. Eyes of Me only had about 6 minutes. But it was really, that was inspired by Waking Life. I remember when I was reading about perception in blind people, I learned that it's the same part of the brain that processes visual perception, that processes dreams, and that processes deeply held memories. And in that moment, the idea of why Rick chose to use animation for his dream, film made sense for my approach to blind teenagers and their perception. And then not long after that, when the decision to make Tower came along, I started thinking about those deeply held memories as also having that same kind of visual dream-like quality. And here we are.
Right. So there's very little about Charles Whitman, the actual guy who did the shooting in Tower. It's about the victims and the people who were being victimized or traumatized by being, there, present, or actually getting shot, for that matter. And it occurs to me that, in a weird way, Brody is a little bit Dear Mr. Brody is also. It's definitely about Brody and his saga, as I think I mentioned earlier, but it's kind of more about the letter writers. So is there some kind of a thread there with you guys? I mean, you're siding with the victims or seeing a historic moment through the eyes of the people it affected, not necessarily the perpetrator.
Yeah. I don't think it's fair to make a one-to-one relationship, obviously, between Michael Brody and the sniper at the top
Yeah.
tower. And I don't feel like the letter writers are victims or that Brody was a perpetrator, but I understand the comparison. And I think we saw it from the beginning. Both films are very much about one person making kind of like a drastic intersection with society, really making an impact, and the ripple effects of that impact on countless lives. And that is something I'm drawn to as a storyteller personally, is the ways that we impact each other and the way that an event, a moment in time, the actions of one person can cause long-standing impact for other people. I do think that's something that both films share, and it's a theme that I'm drawn to. I don't think I'm done exploring. I think there are a lot of stories like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah. Do you want to add to that at all?
I think we talk a lot about trauma in storytelling as well, and kind of, and how do you move through it? And we find through Tower that they did not talk about it. The people who were shot didn't talk about it. Their family members didn't talk about it. Like, doing this documentary was completely ripping the Band-Aid off for a lot of people. And I think it was a healing moment. So I think that if there's a chance for us to maybe have a moment of healing with the people that we're working with, I think that's something that we hope to find. We don't always know that that's what we're looking for, but in the end, it kind of, I feel like repeatedly that's happened through the stories we've been telling.
Yeah. So I would just to add to that real quick, James. Every time I point a camera at somebody, when it's something like any of these stories where this is like a heavy subject matter, this is like a deep. I always try and create a bond that acknowledges what hangs in the balance here, and knowing that we're asking people to open up, to share of themselves, to enter what can be very dangerous and scary territory. You ask people to be vulnerable, and to that end, we try to be vulnerable to the process as well, and to meet them there, to match that, and to acknowledge that every moment that we spend working on these projects is a process. And honestly, as independent filmmakers, we're never even positive when we start that we're going to end up completing the film. We always hope to, but it's such a process. It's such an uphill battle that if the moment by moment process doesn't have rewards built into it.
Such a great point. Yep.
Yeah. So it was cathartic. On Tower, it was overwhelmingly cathartic. We had no sense that it would be so. On Brody, we found lots and lots of moments of connection and catharsis and reflection. And I think we're still putting it together with Brody. It wasn't the same as Tower. With Tower, it was such an overarching trauma that even the newest person to the story understood immediately, this is a shooting, this is a tragedy. With Brody, it's a more complicated story. Right. It's a big idea. For some people, it really worked out. For other people, not at all. For Michael, more than anybody, and his family and loved ones, it was really tragic.
Right.
And how to balance all of that, and how to pull meaning from that, and even understand ourselves, for our team. Why are we drawing these stories, and what do they mean to us? That's the process as well. So just like we didn't find the collage, addition till deep into the process, we don't always know why we're drawn to these stories or what they mean to us until fairly deep in the process. And sometimes it's not even until these Q&As that we understand.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So maybe my last question, and it's not exactly a light one, but so be it. Having made Tower, I have to imagine that, we're all affected by news like we just had a couple days ago about the shooting in Buffalo, right?
Yes.
But do you feel like you guys are particularly invested in those stories, or particularly, moved by hearing, oh God, another shooting, because the thing about the Whitman thing was that was 25 years before we really had a vocabulary around that was a one-time incident at the time, a loon up in a tower shooting people, and now it's a common occurrence every other day. So that, do you feel maybe the question is, do you feel exhausted by the fact that they just keep coming since you made this film?
I think we're all exhausted by it. When we were making Tower, Sandy Hook happened. And I remember I was right there when I read about it. I was just like pointing outside. I remember the moment hearing about it and just being completely, devastated, thinking we were doing a historical documentary about something that happened way back in the past. And then that happened, and it's just been coming ever since. And I don't know what to think about it. It's hard not to just want to give up. And that's not the right answer either. So
is there any way, so then this will be the last question. Is there any way that Tower, the making of Tower and focusing on the victims, could possibly help viewers cope a little bit better by focusing on the victim and not on the perpetrator?
Yeah. I think I won't presume to speak for victims of gun violence or any public tragedy, but I will say, as somebody who has now met and spoken to many, many people, not just at the Tower shooting, but in the years since, people have reached out to us from Virginia Tech. We've met people who were, who lost children in Sandy Hook, in Miami, in the club down there, in the Las Vegas shooting. And what I hope that film reminds others of is that when these shootings happen, we learn so much about what went wrong, what fell through the cracks, what security systems failed, and what manifestos and childhood traumas they suffered, and weird ideas that were, festering. And more we learn about the victims as well. But the news cycle as it is, only focuses on these shootings for a brief amount of time. And honestly, then there's always another one and another one and plenty that don't get national attention. And the reality is, and this is what I took away from Tower more than anything, is that the people who've survived these events, not even just the people who were impacted by the bullets, or the people who lost loved ones, but tangential players, people who grew up nearby, it creates a community of trauma. And that trauma doesn't go away. It doesn't get wiped away. That trauma is compounded by these stories. And so if there's anything I hope that the film does is I hope that it offers a little bit of a context, a vessel within which to put some of the feelings that come up with these shootings. There is no easy answer, or the answers that seem easy to us don't seem to be palatable to our society or to our lawmakers. And, that's a whole other discussion, but I don't know what to tell people, and I don't even know how to feel myself. But what I remind myself is how it felt talking to Claire Wilson, the woman at the center of Tower, how it felt talking to the children whose parents were lost that day, and the grandkids, who grew up with this story kind of in the periphery of their family life, but weren't able to engage directly with it. It gets back to what Sarah said about Brody and these letter writers. We don't talk enough about what bothers us. We don't talk enough about what impacts us. We don't talk enough about what's bogging us down as individuals, and keeping us from engaging with each other, from connecting and finding liberation and consciousness and all the wonderful things that we seek. And so I seek that stuff through our work. I seek connection by pointing a camera at people. And, obviously we're drawn to these large stories with deep impacts. But the reality is, like, day-to-day life is a series of small stories with minimal impacts, but it all matters. And so that's, if anything, I've learned from the filmmaking process is what I was saying a moment ago, that each day-by-day process, each step matters. and each connection matters. It's easy to forget in our regular lives. I need to be better about it, but that's what we love about filmmaking. I mean, we make films because we love films. We love going into a dark place, looking up at the illuminated wall, and seeing our lives play out through other people's experiences, and recognizing little bits and pieces of ourselves and our loved ones and our children and our parents up on that screen, and then walking out when the lights come up, and taking a moment to recognize what matters to us, So that's why we appreciate being invited here, James, to talk with you and the wonderful people up in Newburyport, because that's what we make these films for. We make them to connect with people. We make them to understand this world a little bit better. And I hope that people in your audience will reflect back to us on Twitter or YouTube in the comments what they think about the film, what they take away from these projects, because we're still learning.
Right. Well, that's why we are, you just said it really well, but that's why we love documentaries, right? I mean, it is about all of our lives. There's nothing that's uncovered. And in the idea that, this is a place where we can all come together to hear more of people's stories, which a lot of which end up being suppressed or, kept inside or whatever, and they shouldn't be. So we're just going to take a quick moment to pause. You guys stay here for a second, but we're just going to thank our sponsors really briefly with a little screen grab thing. But thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate talking to you, and I love your filmmaking. We're really looking forward to seeing what you do next, and hopefully we'll have you on again in a couple of years or 5 years.
You need to come in person, yeah.
In person, that's it. There's a thought. Yeah, exactly. Thanks again, folks. We'll see you next month on the Watch Club, and hang on one second, Keith and Sarah.